Alright, hello everyone, my name is Daniel, this is Carl and Esther, and today we're going to be talking about the history of treaty making in Canada based on chapter 27 of our Indigenous Rights textbook. But before I continue, let me grab my script. There we go. Now with that out of the way, let's get right into this video. When Europeans first arrived in Canada, they weren't exactly the dominant group in power. They only had a few settlers, and let's be honest, they needed help surviving. At this stage, Europeans and Indigenous people dealt with each other on a fairly equal basis. As a matter of fact,
Europeans expanded their relationships and sought Indigenous allies to survive military aggression from other Europeans.
Now, treaties made at this time weren't focused on the land, but instead the specific needs of the people, like military or economic support. Speaking of,
treaties were already a practice among First Nation peoples before the Europeans arrived. These treaties were highly sophisticated oral agreements between nations that handled things like trade or settling conflicts,
and were rooted deeply in respect and renewal. Now, take the Great Law of Peace, for example, which united these 5 tribes into the Haudenosaunee Confederation, which contains around 117 articles and still governs the nation to this day.
Early Europeans understood the concept of treaties and introduced their own protocols, such as written agreements, which blended both Indigenous and European ways of the treaty process. Fast forward to 1613, where the Two-Row Wampum Treaty was created between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. Now, this wasn't a written treaty, but a symbolized one that was represented by a wampum belt made out of quahog shells.
The message behind the treaty was this: coexist in peace without the interference in the affairs of the other.
Between 1613 and 1842, there were over 400 negotiations with the Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous nations with the Europeans, such as the Dutch, the English, the French, and the United States, who aren't European, but there's a difference.
These alliances were renewed every year, and they were vital to the Haudenosaunee.
Unfortunately, not everything stayed peaceful.
Certain nations, such as the Algonquin, had military alliances against the Haudenosaunee, which was soon joined by the British.
Similarly, the French fought against the Haudenosaunee for over a century, having their written non-aggression pacts with Indigenous nations fall flat.
That was until the Great Peace of 1701, which allowed for neutrality in conflicts between the French and the English for a short period of time. While that happened, these two nations right here entered into a series of peace and friendship treaties with the British. Oh, nice. And these treaties, signed between 1725 and 1776, were about commercial trade agreements with a desire for military alliances with the Lanoo and other nations, or at least neutrality regarding conflicts with the French. For Indigenous people, these agreements were reciprocal relationships that were marked by gift-giving and ceremony. But as the British established their supremacy in North America, things began to change.
Instead of honoring these sacred traditions, they saw treaty making as humoring the natives. It was here they began to open up land use for settlers.
By the 19th century, the British were done dealing with the natives. Before 1812, treaties were focused on trade and security more than land. But post-war of 1812, European immigration surged, and the British shifted priorities towards settlement and assimilation to civilized Indigenous peoples.
Treaties made at this time focused on acquiring land for the British settlers, not long-term relationships with Indigenous populations. The Robinson Treaties in the 1850s, for instance, introduced reserves and annual payments, aka annuities. For the first time, Indigenous hunting and fishing rights were explicitly recognized.
Treaty processes were often dishonest and exploitative, marked by forced relocations, shady negotiations, and growing conflict.
Now we fast forward to all the way to 1982, where treaties gained constitutional rights and protections through Section 35 of the Constitution Act. This section recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, meaning they can't just be snapped out of existence.
Canadian courts have since put in place some guidelines for interpreting treaties. Ambiguities must be resolved in favor of indigenous peoples. Restrictions or extinguishment of rights must be interpreted narrowly. Historical and cultural context, including oral histories and oral promises, count as valid evidence. The honor of the crown must be preserved. And lastly, treaty rights are living and can evolve. For example, modern tools for traditional practices.
Now that all sounds fair, right? Well, in theory, yes, but in practice, not so much.
Many court decisions have failed to meet indigenous expectations, chipping away at treaty rights rather than strengthening them.
So from the two-row wampum to the Constitutional Act of 1982, treaty making in Canada has evolved from a relationship of mutual understanding and survival and cooperation to one of colonial dominance, before finally moving towards reconciliation and recognition. Though, there's still a long way to go.